There you go.
Can everybody hear me there in the back? Having sat in the back this morning, I know it's a little difficult. The room's kind of a sound sponge. So I'm the executive director of IAP SOP, and as we were introduced this morning, I won't say anything else except to say that all of the material in IAP SOP's archives, today it's a little over 3 million pages, is available to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My talk leverages that material. In fact, I only discovered the people I'm going to talk to you about as a result of having the same kind of access to that material that we grant to you, so we encourage you to dive in. And with that, I'm going to ask you to rewind to 1878 and the beginning of the decline of what at the time was a very popular occult movement, modern spiritualism. Its membership peaked in the Anglo-American world in about 1878, somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million self-identified spiritualists. The spiritualist movement itself, of course, had somewhat larger numbers. American spiritualists estimating their ranks as high as 11 million. There is no, of course, empirical basis for that data. The movement had a great deal of difficulty. Its physics, as was discussed this morning, was bankrupted beginning in the early 1880s when the luminiferous ether, that undetectable, imponderable medium through which light propagated and through which will and force propagated, was demonstrated to simply not exist. Repeated attempts to get spiritualism's beliefs validated by the law and by science were unsuccessful. Spiritualism itself did the cause no favors by engaging in increasingly outlandish public manifestations, so-called promiscuous materialization seances, which brought the movement into disrepute in the popular press. And when you look at the history of the movement after the late 1870s, aside from a brief second flowering between, say, 1915 and 1930, due almost entirely to Sir Oliver Lodge and Arthur Conan Doyle, the movement went into secular decline. Demand, however, in the popular sphere for the occult did not go into secular decline. Spiritualism failed, at least in part, I would argue, not because of the belief system per se, but because of its business model. If you think about the essence of the spiritualist business model, it involved journals, itinerant lectures, and for-fee sittings, none of which scaled very well. If you look at the lives of the famous spiritualist propagandists, E.H. Britton, for example, or the famous spiritualist mediums, Foster and Slade as two notable examples, the movement delivered no material benefit to its practitioners, and in the case of the mediums, often killed them. Foster and Slade, it could be argued, were both killed in slightly different ways by the nature of their work. The movement promoted hyper-competition, so those of you who are familiar with spiritualism in London will know that there was intense competition among materializing mediums for a finite number of sitters that resulted in the production of ever more fabulous materializations at promiscuous seances, and in some cases led mediums and their supporters to participate in the unmasking of other mediums' practices, up to and including catching mediums out of the cabinets performing full-form materializations. All of these were a reflection of the fact that there was no way to scale spiritualism. The business model was broken. No one could make money doing it. But some people had a better idea. Some of you may recognize James A. Bliss. He did much to bring the movement into disrepute in the early 1880s when he, his common-law wife, and a collection of his followers engaged in a series of particularly audacious full-form materialization seances in Philadelphia that were exposed and that resulted in several public trials for Bliss, his common-law wife, for fraud, bigamy, and several other crimes, at the end of which, having been found guilty, Bliss returns to Boston from whence he had come to Philadelphia, and after a few years of silence, he begins to place this advertisement in spiritualist journals all over the United States. how to become a medium in your own home. Now, it seems pretty benign when you look at it, but in fact it's not, because within the spiritualist movement, the idea that the powers of mediumship were latent in every individual is by no means a settled question. And in fact, most mediums argued that mediums were born and not made, that mediumistic power was unevenly distributed in the population, and indeed most occultists argued this. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you is that the new business model that we see after 1895 is based on a different idea, and that idea is the idea of latent powers, that everyone in this room possesses latent occult powers, and that all that is required to fully actualize those powers and to experience success, however you define that term, is a few dollars out of your pocket and into mine. The Latent Powers movement and the group of men and women who rose to serve this market, a group that Pat Devaney calls the Twilight Mages, the Latent Powers movement was based on a fundamentally simple premise. Let your sexy and effective soul out. Right? You can see all kinds of ads here. I'll draw your attention to this one, which I think is particularly relevant. Some of you will recognize that man, William Town. This is an ad of his from 1899. Most wonderful healing force on earth. Cures all forms of disease without drugs. Develops latent power. Ensures health, happiness, success. Lesson 10 cents. At this very moment, hastening across the country from the West Coast is William Town's future wife, Elizabeth Jones. And together, as Elizabeth and William Town, they will develop her nascent periodical, The Nautilus, into the New Thought marketplace par excellence. To echo Mr. Gilbert's comments this morning, without the wrappers, the supplementary material, and the advertisements, you cannot possibly appreciate the extent to which this periodical, which had the biggest circulation of any New Thought periodical, was a supermarket. A way to gain access to services. So Latent Powers promised the full repertoire of powers that any occult movement had ever promised. Foresight, healing power, control of self and others, sexual prowess, intellectual mastery, material wealth. The word that the Twilight Mages used to describe this was success. Success as defined by whom? You, the person paying me. The mechanisms to achieve success: mind, magnetism, vibration, attraction, nothing that would be unfamiliar to anyone who had studied the magnetic parasciences in the 19th century. The fact that these had been largely invalidated or had been taken unto itself by psychology was irrelevant to the mages. They were perfectly happy to function in an economy where ether was still a vibrant, real part of science. Many synonyms: practical psychology, my favorite, personal magnetism, personal influence, soul development, self-mastery, self-unfoldment, self-attainment, suggestive therapeutics, the mastery of fate. Later in the 20s, this becomes a dominant theme. Mental science, and then surname-isms galore. One of the ways in which the mages took this material unto themselves was to brand it with their own name. Weltmerism, Pattersonism, you name it, they did it. The value proposition was really simple. It was fundamentally premised on lack. You can acquire what you lack. And in this very simple but very effective business model, the key was, of course, to get people to self-identify as lacking something. The business model was very different than the one spiritualism had deployed. So from 1900 onward, the emphasis was on selling lessons, readings, and devices, all of which were backed by authorities, professors, doctors, what have you, who in turn were backed by institutions. Institutions that typically granted degrees of one kind or another, leading to degree mills by the 1930s, particularly in the United States. Everything delivered through the mail with extensive cross-selling. I'll give you a very specific example of what I mean by that. Branding and then lead generation and lead nurturance. Once you identified yourself to me as a Twilight Mage, I never let you go. Whether you wanted to talk to me or not, we were in a long-term conversation because sooner or later, I was going to take money out of your pocket. I've exceeded my profile storage. That's right. Yeah. I've also exceeded my tether. No, I think we. There we go. If you want to see it whole, here it is whole in one advertisement. And I have to use the tone of voice thing. Are you unsuccessful? Discouraged? Despondent? Then join the Psycho Success Club, the most powerful mental organization the world has ever known. If you want to be a member, send your name and address to Professor Elmer E. Knowles, room 34, 126 West 34th Street, New York, New York. What do you lack? This is where the Twilight Mages begin. You would be astounded at the thousands of people who responded to this and similar ads, who self-identified as unsuccessful, discouraged, despondent, broke, alone, short, fat, ugly. The commercial context here is important, particularly in the United States, because although the business model was innovated in the US, it was most successfully executed in London for reasons that will become clear to you. In 1879, the US Postal Service reclassified periodicals, so-called legitimate periodicals, to give them access to the lowest postal rate in the United States, the so-called second-class rate. In the years following, the ad space in monthly magazines doubled, and in weekly magazines, it increased by 27-fold. Tons of available ad space. Almost immediately thereafter, starting in 1890, advertising brokerages rose up who offered advertisers access to all of this ad space without them having any necessity for expertise in those ads. You told your broker what sort of person you wanted to reach. You gave them a large amount of money. They ran your ad campaigns for them. To a large extent, the world works this way to this day. 1895, the U.S. deploys the only legal mechanism it has available to us to fight the Twilight Mages and other scammers who are using this new burgeoning medium. They send out the postal inspectors. And the postal inspectors make use of what are known as fraud orders. So we'll take the case of Sidney Weltmer, a practitioner of Absinthe Healing. Does anybody know what I mean by Absinthe Healing? This is the notion that you pay me $2 and I send you a piece of paper that says I would like you to sit quietly in a darkened room at 11 a.m. on March the 23rd for 30 minutes because I will be sending you healing vibrations. Weltmer was taking in on the order of $5,000 a day in his Absinthe Healing practice at the turn of the century. You need to add at least a zero to that number in order to get a sense of that purchasing power. He was slapped with a fraud order. And all of those envelopes coming into the Nevada, Missouri post office were stamped with the word fraudulent and returned to sender. Now, Weltmer had access to a lot of capital and consequently had access to very good attorneys. And so he fought this fraud order. He fought the fraud order all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1902, in American School of Magnetic Healing versus McAnulty, the poor postmaster of Nevada, Missouri, who had originally exercised the fraud order, the U.S. Supreme Court found that the basis for the suppression of Weltmer's mail, namely that Absinthe Healing was a fraudulent practice, could not stand. The court argued that if you gave me $2 and I gave you an Absinthe Healing experience and you believed you had received it and benefited from it, then the transaction was legitimate. This is something that many people prior to this date had sought to get, that is to say, an open legal space within which to engage in occult practice. It really put the Postal Service on its heels for a couple of years until an enterprising Postal Service inspector did some math and said, Helen Wilmans, another magnetic healer, is receiving 2,000 requests a day for magnetic healing, is taking that money and is asserting that every one of them gets 30 minutes a month of her direct attention. Let's add that up. That number doesn't work. So they began to go after these occult practitioners, not on the basis of the content of their belief system, but on the mechanics thereof. A subtle difference, but highly effective. The Twilight Mage I'm going to talk to you about is someone I suspect none of you have ever heard of, a man named Elmer Sidney Prater. He was known publicly as Elmer E. Knowles. You saw him a minute ago asking if any of you were discouraged or unsuccessful. There he is, circa 1900, as Elmer E. Knowles. Here he is as Sidney Prater in his 1920-something U.S. passport photo. He began life as a stage hypnotist in practice with his wife, Abby, A. Beatrice Knowles, who is an important part of his subsequent life as a Twilight Mage. The two of them conducted this entire business in partnership with one another. He made a good bit of money as a stage hypnotist, and in 1905, he and Abby left the circuit, took their money, and bought into an existing institution, the Metropolitan Institute of Science, run out of New York by another mage, Frederick McIntyre. The Metropolitan Institute of Science granted doctorates in suggestive therapeutics. No coursework required. Many people, including Professor S.J. Poole in this ad, advertised the fact that they had such credentials from such an august institution. The Postal Service, however, thought it was a fraudulent operation. In 1907, they slapped it with a fraud order, but because Elmer had access to money and good attorneys, he beat the fraud order. McIntyre decided he didn't want to stay in the business, so Prater bought him out. McIntyre went on to have an august but anonymous career as, surprise, surprise, an advertising copywriter. A year later, in 1908, he founds the Modern Science Publishing Company, which some of you may be familiar with because it published a periodical called Modern Miracles, which in turn published both Reuben Swinburne Clymer and H. Spencer Lewis, the founder of the AMORC Rosicrucian movement. Spencer Lewis had been in partnership for years with an astrologer named A.H. Postel, and they were doing a very lucrative business as mail-order astrologers. And Prater essentially acquired their entire method, all of their apparatus, and A.H. Postel himself, and started running that business that you saw being run out of 128th Street in New York until 1909. He'd beaten 2 more fraud orders by then, but unfortunately, he'd also beaten almost to death a process server who showed up in their offices one day to serve him with papers in a civil lawsuit. And so he and his wife and his brother-in-law and A.H. Postel and 7 or 8 other folks associated with the operation decided that it was probably a good idea to go elsewhere, and they came to London. And they established a pattern that was pursued by other mail-order mages of running their U.S. operation out of London at the same time that they were running their European operations out of Belgium and France. He runs it very successfully. In 1911, one of his former English employees tries to blackmail him, thinking that he'll make a quick 500 pounds and that Prater will pay up rather than have the secrets of his operation exposed. Prater says, "Screw you, I'll see you in court." And so in the court records, we get the first view of the scale of Prater's operation, and it was astounding. He had 100 clerks processing his mail, each of whom he paid £1 a week. His German correspondence, half of which contained money, amounted to about 5,000 letters a week. He was taking an extraordinarily large amount of money. Continues to run that operation and scale it. Finally, he moves to France. He buys a large chateau outside of Paris. He turns that into an international golf and country club. And for the last 15 years of his life or so, just sits back and lets his money and his global operations do the work for him. When he dies in 1939, his estate is up in the air for some years, in part because his country club is occupied by the Nazis. But when they finally settle his estate in the early 40s, There's 64,000 pounds in his UK estate. Now, if you want to calibrate that, when Emma Harding Britton died in 1899, her entire estate was worth 225 pounds. Now, granted, we're 40 years on, but we are orders of magnitude larger. And his U.S. heirs, when they finally get control of the country club, divide up $530,000 US, which is $7.5 million worth of purchasing power today. That is a vast fortune from the occult. What did this look like? Let's take this case. That handsome devil is Clay Burton Vance, the eminent Parisian occultist. He does not exist. He never has existed. He is a cutout. That's not a picture, it's a drawing. Many people, including the U.S. Postal Service, believed that Clay Burton Vance was a real human being and they pursued him. And in fact, some people argue to this day that he was real. He was not. He was a cutout. You would respond to an ad like this, free character readings to all readers who write at once, and you would get a letter from Paris. Now, if you were Josephine Ferguson living in Newburgh, New York in 1913, getting a letter like that from Paris in and of itself was a cultural event. But what was inside of it was astounding. There was a letter, a personal letter from Clay Burton Vance. And there was your complete life reading, personalized for you. Look, there it is. There's my name. There's my birth date. Those are the only things in that reading, which you can inspect at your leisure, that have any bearing on this particular woman. The rest of it was a series of very carefully selected forms pulled from bins in a mailroom using the system pioneered by Spencer Lewis and A.H. Postel. The goal was to fail to satisfy Josephine on the first go-round. And the letter says, please, get in touch with me. Tell me how you feel about this reading that I've given you. This is the beginning of the nurturance conversation. This is the free part of the deal. There would be other things in the envelope. What we would recognize today as dream books, magic stones. This is cross-selling. Maybe you don't want a life reading. Maybe you'd rather have a dream book. Maybe you'd rather have a lucky stone. Let's put a lot of things in front of you and see what you point at. Oriental Jewels Company, Economy Supply Company, all Prather operations. He owns them all. Most interestingly, there's a clipping. Look at that interesting clipping. Now, those of us who've been working in this area have seen this clipping in 7 different languages. This one happens to be in English because, of course, it was delivered to a woman in New York. It looks like it was cut out of a newspaper, but when you look at it closely, you realize it was actually printed that way. It looks like there's a note from Clay Burton Vance on it, but in fact, it's not. It's so verisimilitudinous that there's something on the back of it to make it look like a clipping, but it is pointing you at another cutout, Elmer E. Knowles. And when you write to Knowles, you get some material, including this very attractive woman, that would be Prather's wife, Abby, with a device. What is that mysterious device that she's holding up? It's the Knowles Radio Hypnotic Crystal, also known as the ocular fatigue inducer. It is the essential element in the Elmer E. Knowles system of self-hypnosis, which, if practiced diligently, will allow you to achieve success. Very sophisticated model, very carefully planned out, very carefully executed by clerks. I won't take you through all of it. What I will simply say to you is there is no substantive difference between the way they developed leads in 1900 and the way we do it today. This is the beginning of direct marketing. If you show this to an internet marketeer today, they will immediately go, oh yeah, I know what that is. They use the mail. Today, we get it electronically, but it is all about coercing you into particular channels of behavior. And in the case of these guys, it was all about driving you through a series of free offers and getting you to buy a series of lessons. That is the essence of Twilight Magery. These lessons were incredibly elaborate. So the Elmer E. Knowles Complete System of Personal Influence and Healing, this happens to be a complete list of the lessons taken from the 1927 fraud case against Elmer E. Knowles. The post office also believed that Knowles was a real human being, not simply another Prather cutout. Had 6 branches. Basic principles: hypnosis, telepathy, and personal magnetism, autosuggestion and self-treatment, magnetic healing, character reading comprising physiognomy, phrenology, and chirology, and then finally, the best for last, Oriental methods. There's a reason why the Oriental methods are in branch 6. No connection with the supernatural, ladies and gentlemen. This is science. Branch 6, we discover, is conducted not by Professor Elmer E. Knowles, but by another cutout, Swami Ramayandas, who, as a real Hindu priest, should be in the best position to teach us about Oriental methods in hypnotism, telepathy, concentration, magnetic healing, magic, and the wonders of the Orient. Look at the power emanating from his fingertips. Tens of thousands of people purchased this series of lessons. All of the lessons came with testimonials because, of course, when you are in the business of filling something you lack, what you want to know is that others, people who are attractive, articulate, people who are authorities, have found what they lacked. And to get a sense of how elaborate these can be, here's part of one of the mailings from Prather's biggest competition, Ewing Virgil Neal. Absolute proof must convince all men. Genuine words of praise that tell the whole story. These things were folded up and stuffed into envelopes and landed in the hands of people all over the English-speaking world. They were very effective in communicating the message that you were safe in giving Knowles or Neal or Sidney Flower, the third big player in this space, your money. Whoop. Oh, I just broke it. There we go. And last but not least, it came with a money-back guarantee. Now, the money-back guarantee served 2 purposes. It was about the safety for the buyer. You probably didn't read the fine print that said you had to express your dissatisfaction within 10 days when your first lessons arrived, because what you were focused on were the Hindu and Oriental methods in branch 6, which came last. Served somewhat as a prophylactic when the postal inspectors showed up. Well, we've never had anybody ask for their money back, so we must have satisfied customers. The Twilight Mages taught occult practitioners some pretty important lessons collectively. They operated very successfully right up to the beginning of the Second World War. The first is that the occult can be made to pay, and they underscored something that we knew since the late 1870s, which is that practical occultism, occultism that results in the acquisition of power or skill, can in particular be made to pay. Lack is lack. All of these guys sold occult and non-occult products. And in fact, some of the biggest legal trouble they had was not because of the occult materials they were selling, but because they were also selling poisonous dietary supplements, eyesight restorers that blinded people, and things as exotic as cartilage stretchers, machines that would actually make you taller. Because if you lacked, you lacked. I need personal magnetism, I need 2 inches of height, I need a better job, I need a girlfriend. The broadest possible range they can service, they serviced. Institutional credentialing is key. There is a reason why occult-oriented institutes proliferate after 1900. It is in part to credentialize the people who are working within them. Publications are for demand creation, not communication. This is kind of the inverse of the situation Mr. Gilbert described this morning, in which librarians strip away all of that extraneous material before they bind a volume, leaving only the articles. Well, the people publishing those. We're mostly interested in the stuff that was stripped away or that was tacked on at the end. That's actually the heart of the occult journal after 1900, I would argue. Use existing distribution networks, don't fight switch, operate in friendly geographies, and execution tells the tale. This was not a foolproof formula. There were many people who tried to do this and failed, and many people who were successful. So I'll close by reflecting on something that was said earlier today, the idea of open secrets. Every one of these mages had in his repertoire a series of lessons on how to enter the mail order business, and they sold them. There was no sense in which their methods were closely held. They were broadcast. If you'd like to look at a homegrown English mail order mage, I invite you to look at one of my personal favorites, Professor Zazra. He was born Arthur Edward Tapner. He worked for most of his life as Arthur Drew Clifton, although after his arrest and prosecution in 1923 under the Vagrancy Act for fortune telling, his specialty was life readings delivered to people in Africa and Asia at that time. He operated for the last period of his life as Stanley Bruce, teaching other people how to do mail order like this. He was the chief mystic of the Hindu school of protection, and he always appears in adverts as you see him here. At the same time, on the inside back cover of the Occult Review, he's selling scrying crystals. And lest I be accused of talking about dead white men, I invite you to consider Ethel Marsh Stiles, or as she was known in the trade, Ohashnu Hara. You laugh, but she is still a significant figure in New Age circles to this day. Her material still circulates. And she, in many ways, is paradigmatic of what the Twilight Mage was all about. She published and sold lessons. She sold devices. She ran a demand creation journal called Wings of Truth, which is available on IAP SOP, that included her own success circle, which had thousands of members that she marketed to. She's still operating, at least textually, in our thought to this day. And fascinating figure. And then lastly, Ewing Virgil Neal. Neal was the single biggest competitor to Elmer Sidney Prather. If any of you know this man's name, you know him because after about 1925, he was the head of a wildly successful international cosmetics conglomerate called Tokalon, servicing a different kind of lack and a different kind of audience. At the same time that he was known throughout the commercial world as the founder and head of the Tokalon cosmetics empire, his cutout, Xenophon Lamont Sage, was operating in our marketplace, selling lessons to people who lacked mastery of the secrets of hypnotic influence. That's where he began, and he operated that business until he died in Switzerland, again, in the early 1940s, having been thrown out of his 28-acre estate in the Côte d'Azur by the Nazis, who used it to headquarter an SS brigade. The interesting question for me is, which one of the two is a cutout, Ewing Virgil Neal or Xenophon Lamont Sage? And I'll give you a clue. At about this time, he had his only child, a male child, by his third wife in Paris, and he named his child Xenophon Lamont Neal. And that's my shtick. I wish you success. Does that mean I'm